Good morning, folks. It's Wednesday, April 16th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 558 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, I got to ask this question. Will the real Stephen Witkoff please stand up? The president's chief envoy to everything from the hostages in Gaza to the Iran nuclear deal had quite a reversal yesterday after first coming under fire from critics saying that he wanted to cap Iranian enrichment at 3.67%. The envoy in chief now says the regime in Tehran has to dismantle its nuclear program in its entirety. I guess that's a step in the right direction, but it's not exactly inspiring confidence among those who fear that we're about to get fleeced by those wily Iranian negotiators. Witkoff is clearly learning the nuclear file as it goes. It's a hell of a learning curve, folks, and we are watching him climb it in real time. I'm nervous about a novice tackling this file, but I wish him nothing but success. Our guest today is Ryan Brobst. Ryan is a senior research analyst with FDD Center on Military and Political Power, which is chaired by my colleague Bradley Bowman. You may recall that Brad was a host here on this program. Ryan and Brad recently released a truly excellent monograph titled Arsenal of Democracy, which explores the capacity of the United States government to effectively arm its three most important and embattled allies, Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, simultaneously. I sat down with Ryan yesterday for a pre-recorded conversation about this timely and meticulously researched report, which is already influencing how decision makers are approaching military aid to America's best partners. U.S. officials just announced a reduction of American forces in Syria. Right now, we have around 2,000 service members stationed there. We could soon see that number cut in half. The timing is not great. It comes on the heels of the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime and the rise of HTS, an al-Qaeda affiliate group backed by Turkey. Turkey is eager to exploit that vacuum in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan is itching to control the skies over Damascus and to hammer the militant Kurdish groups that he says pose a threat to his country. The Israelis are having none of that. They vowed to protect the Druze minority, to keep the border area clear of hostile actors, and they've bombed air bases the Turks have tried to occupy. It's a dicey scene in Syria, one that benefits from the presence of American warfighters. They've helped skirmishes. They've kept skirmishes to the minimum in years since ISIS was dismantled. Look, I get the calls to bring our warfighters home, but before we do, we'd be wise to broker a better arrangement between Turkey and Israel. Right now, tensions are flaring. The last thing we need is more conflict in the Middle East. Trump is pals with both Bibi and Erdogan. Maybe he could invite those two for a sit-down to sort out their differences. I don't see Trump getting a Nobel Prize for that, but it's a parlay that needs to happen if the goal is to prevent more ugliness in the Middle East after a pretty ugly year and a half. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Jordan arrested 16 people linked to the Muslim Brotherhood who were involved in a plot to undermine Jordan with targeted attacks. Jordanian authorities have apparently been monitoring the network since 2021. Jordan's General Intelligence Department, the GID, said the group was manufacturing rockets, planning to produce drones, and training operatives inside and outside of Jordan. The leader of the cell was reportedly based in Lebanon. I've seen reports of connections to Turkey as well. Shocker there. The name of the game was chaos and sabotage. A government spokesperson said that suspects were manufacturing missiles with a range of about 3 miles, which means that they probably wanted to use them domestically. At least one rocket was ready to launch. The Jordanian government released footage of the suspects confessing that they were recruited by the Muslim Brotherhood. I expect a massive crackdown in the days and weeks ahead. Buckle up, folks. This could get messy. Jordan is unstable. Headline 2, the European Union announced a new aid package for the Palestinian Authority. It's about 1.6 billion euros. That's close to $2 billion. The EU plans to provide more than a third of the money over the next 2 years as direct budgetary support for the Palestinian Authority. About $650 million in grants will fund projects across the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and another $450 million in low-cost loans will be dished out to the private sector. I support that. But this next part deserves an eye roll. The EU is planning to give $93 million to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency that refugee agency, or so-called refugee agency, that is basically Hamas in UN clothing. The EU is also launching a Palestine donor platform to serve as a forum for the PA to provide updates on its purported reform efforts and eventually to help coordinate Gaza reconstruction, with the end game involving the PA controlling Gaza. Captain Obvious reporting for duty here. That just can't happen while the corrupt, terror-lauding autocrat Mahmoud Abbas is still in charge. Someone needs to knock some sense into our European friends. Headline 3, Lebanese President Joseph Aoun says 2025 is the year that the Lebanese Armed Forces, the LAF, must gain a monopoly of arms in his country. We all know what that means. It means that Hezbollah must be disarmed. And that's exactly what Aoun said. He wants the Iran-backed terror group not just to give up its weapons, but also to fold their fighters into the Lebanese army. That sounds better than a terrorist group under the command of Tehran. But here's my question. Will the LAF be absorbing Hezbollah, or will Hezbollah be absorbing the LAF? That's the question that needs to be answered here, folks. And now for the part about Israel. Aoun is calling for Israel to leave the 5 military outposts it established on the border with Lebanon as he tries to navigate this thorny challenge. I wish him luck, but he says that Israel's very presence has made it more challenging for him to convince Hezbollah to disarm, which is funny because it was the Israeli military operations last year that weakened Hezbollah enough to make the very idea of disarmament possible. So, hey, Joseph, Israel's your ace in the hole here with Hezbollah. Maybe just pipe down and do your job. When you're done, I'm sure the Israelis will be more than happy to leave. All right, it's time to press play on that interview with Ryan Brobst. We recorded it yesterday. His new report, co-authored with Brad Bowman of CMPP, Arsenal of Democracy, is making waves in the White House and beyond. So sit back, relax, and have a listen. Welcome to the program, Ryan Brobst.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Ryan, you recently co-authored a monograph. It's called Arsenal of Democracy, Arming Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel While Strengthening the U.S. Industrial Base. You wrote it with our colleague, Brad Bowman. It's a terrific monograph. I want to congratulate you for it. I want to ask you a few questions. So the first question is, what is the Defense Industrial Base, otherwise known as the DIB? We hear a lot about it right now in the media. Just break it down for us. What do we mean when we say the DIB?
Yeah, the Defense Industrial Base, or the DIB, is essentially just the network of companies and facilities that produce the munitions and systems used by the U.S. military, as well as our allies and partners. It's kind of the system that won World War II, won the Cold War, but it's atrophied significantly since then, and it's something that Washington is trying to fix.
Why did it atrophy? What is the problem here? I mean, our resources, you could argue, are probably as plentiful, if not more so, than they were when, for example, we were producing weapons for the Gulf War or the war in Iraq or any other conflict. So why have we atrophied?
The problems really started in the 1990s with the peace dividend. There's just the downturn in defense spending caused a massive consolidation to the few contractors that we have now. A lot of the small, more nimble businesses went out of business, and some production lines had almost completely shut down, like the Stinger missile. And it's a lot harder to restart a production line than to keep one going, as we found out in 2022.
Got it. Okay, so now the piece that you've written, this report that you've written with our talented colleague, Brad Bowman, why did you undertake this research and what are the core findings? I mean, from what I understand here, you just read the title of the book. I've read the report, but what you're basically saying is, if I'm going to try to sum up the thesis, it's that we can build our own defense industrial base, and we can provide the weapons needed to Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel. We're saying we can do all of those things, but why did we need to write a full report?
Yeah, so Brad and I started this project in 2023 when some in Washington were asserting without evidence that aid to Ukraine was responsible for delays in weapons deliveries to Taiwan, and were using that as an excuse to deprive Ukraine of the means of self-defense. Brad and I had a sneaking suspicion that the actual story was a lot more complicated than this, and whether or not Ukraine was responsible for this was an empirical fact, not just a matter of opinion. And then after Hamas's horrible October 7th terror attack, we started looking at deliveries to Israel as well.
Okay, so you guys start looking at the defense industrial base, you start looking at the weapons, you look at how much there is to go around. How do you go about investigating such a large and sprawling data set?
Yeah. So it started, as all good research projects do, with a list. So we looked at the list of all foreign military sales to Taiwan that the U.S. government had announced since 2015, and we compared that with the list of systems that was provided to Ukraine that the U.S. government has put out. The Biden administration was significantly less transparent about aid to Israel, but we were still able to identify plenty of systems through open sources. And we ended up with a list of 25 major weapon systems to investigate, including things like Stinger missiles, HIMARS, the ATACMS ballistic missile, and JDAMs. And what we did is we classified them by Ukraine impact, which is, how big of a delay due to Ukraine was there, and by defense industrial base health. How healthy is the production line, and how healthy are our stockpiles?
All right. So let me just ask maybe a basic question, but I think it's far more complicated. How is it possible that aid to Ukraine didn't delay weapons to countries like Taiwan or Israel? And how is it possible that the U.S. can support all three partners, and yet at the same time, the defense industrial base is under significant strain and needs major reform? I mean, it seems like all of this feels like almost a Gordian knot. How do you begin to untie all of this and make sense of it?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of nuance here, but it essentially boils down to four main reasons that we can support all three, and that their needs overlap a little bit less than you might expect. So the first reason is because there's significant differences due to geography and the type of conflict that each partner is facing. Let's take anti-ship missiles for an example. Israel does not have a significant need for large anti-ship missiles because Hamas and Hezbollah don't field large warships. Ukraine had a small need for these, which they got from U.S. Allies in NATO, and they used them to sink several Russian ships, and then we're working on destroying the rest of the Black Sea fleet with drone boats. However, Taiwan needs a lot more of this type of system. So it's a difference in scale, even if the needs overlap a little bit. Second reason is that the production lines for systems that do overlap are also healthy or expanding. HIMARS is actually a pretty good example of this. Taiwan expanded its order after the Russian invasion, likely because they saw how well the system was performing. And they're actually now going to get their order sooner than expected because HIMARS production has over doubled since 2022. Another example is when the U.S. just has large stockpiles of a system, such as the JDAM, which is the guidance kit attached to unguided bombs dropped from aircraft. We have tens of thousands of them. We produce tens of thousands of them and still have spare production capacity left. So we can just produce enough of them.
All right, those are really specific and I think really helpful to give folks an understanding of what each of our allies, our democratic allies, need right now to fight the wars that they're either preparing for or are currently engaged in. And I think that's crucial, important nuance that you have provided. And I think it's a direct rebuke to those who are saying, well, we can't share any weapons with certain allies, right? I mean, we see this, right? People are picking and choosing who they decide they want to support. They say, well, we can't support the Ukrainians because of the restrictions with the DIB, or we can't support the Israelis because of the restrictions with the DIB. What you've actually shown, what you and Brad have shown, is that we can actually walk and chew gum. We can have our cake and eat it too. And that is crucial. So I got to say, you guys have done unbelievable work here. And I think you've really just held up a mirror to those that have engaged in what I would call isolationist thinking or quasi-isolationist thinking, saying we can't support our friends in need. But that said, I think you and Brad do acknowledge that there are significant reforms that are needed for the DIB to be healthy, for the United States to be in a position where we can defend ourselves and we can help our friends defend themselves. So what are some of the reforms that you and Brad have proposed, and how likely is it that the Trump administration will implement these reforms?
Yeah, so there's actually great news on this front. We had started sharing our initial findings and recommendations with the government as early as November 2023, and some of them were just implemented in an executive order that was released on April 9th. So in that executive order, quickly, there was three things that it did that we had called for in our report. The first is working to reduce the threshold for congressional notification on arms sales. Basically, if there's an arms sale above a certain dollar amount, Congress has to approve it. But this number hasn't been updated for inflation since 1981. I know we've been complaining a lot about inflation for the past few years, so you can imagine what it's like 4.5 decades of inflation, what that's done to that number. The second one is establishing a list of priority partners for arms transfers. As we like to say, first come, first serve might work well at McDonald's, but that's probably not a good approach to U.S. national security. So identifying countries like Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel that should be at the front of the line for arms transfers is a good step. And then the third thing it did was reviewing the FMS only list. This is a list of systems that are only available through the FMS process, which is where the Pentagon negotiates on behalf of foreign governments with US companies, and it's very slow. So if we can take some systems off the list and allow foreign governments to negotiate directly with American companies, it could speed up the process.
FMS, of course, being foreign military sales.
Yes, exactly. And DCS being direct commercial sales, kind of the other approach.
Got it. We love our acronyms in Washington, so bear with us, folks who are watching or listening at home. All right, last question for you before I let you go. U.S. assistance to Israel seemed like a really good test case of your hypothesis, what you and Brad have forwarded here. Given that Hamas's attack, it came a year and a half into the United States supporting the war in Ukraine. In other words, we had to supply two embattled allies at the same time. It did put strain on the DIB, but you found that by and large, we were able to kind of keep a firewall between the two, and we were able to sufficiently support both allies to help them at least not lose, if not win. I would say that we have I've got my complaints about what we provided to Ukraine. I think we gave them enough not to lose, but didn't give them enough to win. I think with the Israelis, we started giving them what they needed to win, but then we started to pare back on some of those weapons like the MK-84s, the 2,000-pound bombs that were so crucial for Israel's war effort. But those were political decisions. At the end of the day, did you find that the DIB was strong enough, right? Was it healthy enough to support both fronts at the same time?
Yeah, so the simple answer is it was, despite the complaints from Washington and the fact that the U.S. had been supporting Ukraine for about a year and a half at that point. We were able to supply with essentially no notice Israel with a significant amount of munitions. This included thousands of JDAMs, things like 30 millimeter ammunition for Apache helicopters, and Iron Dome interceptors. And the U.S. was even able to supply Israel with 155 millimeter artillery shells, despite that being the system in the highest demand in Ukraine. It was a close run affair, and shells were almost about to be sent to Ukraine from Israel, but Israel eventually did receive all of the shells that it asked for.
Well, I think that's good news. I think we still have a lot of work to do to strengthen the DIB and to prepare for great power competition, as we call it. We've got, obviously, potential conflict looming with the likes of China. Russia is still a problem. We may have other conflicts that erupt around the world. But I think what you've done here with Brad Bowman is really tremendous work. Brad and Ryan, for folks at home, they are at the helm of our Center on Military and Political Power, also known as CMPP. Here at FDD, they do tremendous work. Recommend everybody take a look at this monograph. It's called Arsenal of Democracy. Ryan Brobst, I want to thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. Definitely enjoyed bringing on some of our young bucks, getting them a little bit of exposure here at the FDD Morning Brief. Absolutely recommend everybody download that report and read it. Okay. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Craig Singleton, Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, Jack Burnham, and Annie Fixler, the four of them have submitted a public comment to the Federal Communications Commission on outlining how the Chinese Communist Party, leveraging its state-backed industries and sweeping surveillance laws, is seeking to dominate global submarine cable infrastructure. That's a direct threat to U.S. national security. My colleagues voiced strong support for the FCC's proposed regulation to counter this menace. In the Washington Examiner, my colleague Ivana Stradner examines the psychological manipulation tactics that Russia employs to erode Western support for Ukraine. She explains how the Kremlin is trying to sow fear and hesitation among Kyiv's allies, deterring them from providing essential military aid. Ivana urges the Trump administration to resist falling for Putin's deceitful strategies and instead respond with unwavering resolve to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine and beyond. Finally, don't miss FDD's event tomorrow, April 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern, focused on the growing threat of malicious cyber activities targeting U.S. transportation infrastructure. Scary stuff, fascinating stuff. I highly encourage you to tune into that live stream. And with that, we're going to wrap it today, folks. If you're looking for a good read, check out the expert analysis we post on our website, fdd.org. Lots to choose from there. Scroll through our quick takes on X at FDD, or just take a cruise through our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please feel free to contribute to our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. We are sincerely grateful to all of our donors for helping to make this work possible. Tune in Friday for another riveting episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We have an incredible guest lined up. I'm not going to spoil it, but trust me, you will not be disappointed. Hope to see you on Friday. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.